2 years ago, the guys from Renesys were here to talk to you about BGP instability they observed during the code red worms and the NIMDA worm. I remember there was a lot of skepticism at the time about why this should have happened or what the cause was, since BGP is supposed to be immune to congestion or not dependent on congestion measurements. They came over and talked to us at the same time at Dartmouth because we happened to be in the same small town up in New Hampshire. And we were interested at the time in a variety of, or capturing a number of indications and warnings about global internet health. So we decided to look at BGP in addition to some of the other areas that we were looking in having to do with scanning worms, distributed honeypots, looking at ICMP scan traffic, a number of different methods that we were looking at to get a global picture of what was going on the internet. So we looked and looked and looked at BGP data for a long, long time, and nothing interesting ever happened. Until January of 2003, of course, stuff was happening, but nothing interesting from a global perspective. Until January 2003, when the slammer worm came along, and I think it pretty much put to rest any notion that or any doubt that there was a relationship between scanning worms and BGP instability. I started to look at the data, and I wanted some way to compare it to previous worm epidemics, specifically the code red and the NIMDA worm epidemics, and I had no yardstick. There was no standard measurement for which to measure these things. So that's what I came here to talk about today. Page down. So everyone has their metrics, measures and indicators. In biology, we talk about vital signs like blood pressure, body temperature, pulse, and respiration. Meteorology has your standard measurements, seismic, economic indicators. In nearly every field of study, there is a state vector that you can describe the whole universe with. And even though it's reductive, it's still useful. It's useful because otherwise we wouldn't use these numbers. And we're all familiar with these numbers. We hear them on an almost daily basis. But in our field of study, in internet health and internet stability, there is no such collection of standardized metrics. So if lacking that standard yardstick, how do we compare the events that traumatize the internet? How do we compare their various effects on things like stability? Events like scanning worms or September 11th or the Baltimore tunnel fire or the Northeast blackout. How do we describe and monitor current conditions as well? So how do we say what is the current conditions on the internet right now? We still don't have a vocabulary. We don't have a standard list of metrics that we can use. So if you're on the Nanog mailing list and something's happening, people are saying, I'm seeing a lot of activity, or I'm seeing this kind of activity, but there's no number that they can point to. So there are a variety of ways to actually look at the internet and say, what is its state right now? There are commercial companies that everybody's familiar with that measure packet loss and latency. We can talk about traumatic events in terms of the availability of services like email and web services. And in interdomain routing, we probably are reduced to two areas, and that's stability and reachability. So moving towards some kind of standard BGP metrics, and I'm not here to propose a standard, and I'm not here to propose that the way that we're looking at it is the only way to looking at it. I'm just throwing out the idea that what we need to be working towards is some kind of standard yardstick. Whatever metrics we come up with should be reductive. Reductive is bad in one sense, as you lose detail, you lose insight. On the other hand, we have to dampen some transient phenomenon if we're talking about global internet health. The things like reset spikes and all the other sort of things that can cause local routing instability are not the sort of things that you want to be strongly indicated in a global indicator. We want to look at widespread phenomenon, and it should be on some kind of standardized scale. So again, going back to the two areas that I think BGP is useful in looking at are instability and reachability. Instability could be based on route flapping, or it could be based on the time density of route announcements and withdrawals, just looking at updates per minute. Reachability can be based on table sizes measured in the total number of IP blocks, which is up around 130,000 these days, or it could be further extrapolated to the total number of IP addresses in a particular table. There are problems with both of those methods, and I'll try to touch on that. So after the slammer worm, I tried to come up with some kind of metric that I could use to standardize and measure these things. So given n BGP peers, I have BGP peering relationships, say, with 10 different routers that are scattered across the globe, topologically and geographically dispersed. So for each peer, each one that's feeding me data, I'm not a router now, I'm just a collector, I'm an observer. For each one of these peers, I want to calculate a local weighting factor that tells me how active this local router is. And so what I do there is I just simply take the hourly average of activity, total updates and withdrawals per, announcements and withdrawals per hour, and I take 1,000 divided by that factor, and that gives me a pretty good number. We call that W. For each one of those weights, then we have for each peer, we count the announcements and withdrawals per minute over a 15-minute sliding window. Now, why do we use 15 minutes? Well, I experimented with it empirically on data that we were looking at over the course of ordinary days and extremely active days. And what you find is that if you go 30 minutes, you dampen out a lot of the transient stuff, but you also get a lot of time lag. Now, it's 15 minutes before anything is indicated because you're looking at medians. And you could go smaller, like 10 minutes or 5 minutes, but then you're going to get a lot of false positives. So I chose a 15-minute window because it seems to me give me a pretty good compromise between false positives. And I use that value, that median value, to calculate the local instability index, where the local instability index is just that weighting factor that I talked about, 1,000 divided by the hourly average, multiplied by the median for updates and withdrawals for the past 15 minutes. That gives me a local instability index for each one of my peers, and then I just take the median of that. So I started out just looking at that as a way to understand what was going on. Empirically, what I found is that values between 0 and 50 on this scale that we had developed were pretty much normal instability. On a daily basis, you'll see your values go up and down from 0 to 50, not indicating any particular kind of stress. When you see values go from 50 to 100, you're talking about unstable conditions, and values over 100 are very high instability. You know that something serious is going on. Because of the 15-minute window, as I said, the instability tends to lag by about 8 minutes of significant events. What we found also is that values calculated with very different data sets, for instance, the RIPE repository and the Oregon Root Views repository are extremely similar, and I'll show that in a second. And the high water mark for this index, which has no upper bound, much like the Richter scale has no upper bound, is 536, which was at 12:48 Eastern Standard Time on January 25th, which of course was the slammer worm. The slammer worm. You can see there, right at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time, they pretty much goes right off the chart and then drops down during the course of the day over a course of about 19 hours. And also you can see that in green, the RIPE data, and blue, the Oregon data, are very, very similar. In fact, similarity is 98.6% for this particular day. So this shows two things: not only the worst instability that we've ever seen since we've looked at this, but it also shows that the global instability index, using very different data sets, yields us very similar results. So now we go back and we look at the code red instability on its worst day, which was July 19th, 2001. You see that peaked around 160. You can see that the day started fairly normal, and it wasn't until after noontime Eastern Standard Time that the values started to creep up until they peaked around 161. NIMDA, very similarly, stayed pretty quiet in the beginning of the day, and then uncharacteristically just shot up to the 100 level right after, it looks like about 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on September 18th, 2001. So putting the three really bad days on one slide so you can kind of get from perspective, you see the slammer worm is easily the winner, or the mother of all scanning worms in terms of global instability. Other events, not just scanning worms, that cause global instability. On the morning of July 17th, I was awakened by my beeper because I have it now set to go off anytime the global instability index exceeds 100. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, my beeper went off. Anybody guess why? It's your responsibility. You guys did this to me. You guys were patching for the iOS vulnerability and basically inducing massive amounts of global instability. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, I got on my keyboard and wrote to my friends at the Department of Homeland Security and said, "The internet is under attack." And they wrote back and said, "You're an idiot." So it turns out this pattern repeated itself for 3 days. Right after midnight Eastern Standard Time, everybody started taking down their routers. And the little peaks, if you look at it in more detail, actually kind of correspond with the top of the hour, which more or less suggests scheduled maintenance. Then, so we were ready for the killer worm. The decom vulnerability had been released the same day as I think the iOS vulnerability on July 16th, and we sat and waited for the killer worm that was going to come, and we were ready this time. And the blaster worm was released on August the 11th, and nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. For 3 days, nothing happened. We sat and we watched the global instability index, and we saw mild instability. You can see that in a couple instances it peaks up around the value of 50, and then suddenly at 4:11 Eastern Standard Time on August 14th, the thing goes up and hits 90. And that, of course, was the Northeast blackout. And I was watching that at the same time, seeing my global instability indicator go up, and watching global reachability go down. And there again, I wrote to my friends at the Homeland Security Department and said, something happened and I don't think it's a worm. And sure enough, 5 minutes later, we turned on CNN and found out it was the blackout. If you want more information on that, there's a really good report on the Renesys website about the BGP effects on global routing. Excuse me, the global routing effects of the blackout. So I said that this reachability was another area. I'm sort of working towards a global reachability index as well. This shows what the global reachability index kind of looked like during that 2-day period. There was a plummet in reachability. And here I just take the maximum table size for all the routers that I'm looking at, and I divide that by its current table size. That's a pretty simple index. And you can see that basically 3% of the internet disappeared at 4:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then slowly came back over the course of about 24 hours. A very similar profile basically happened during the slammer worm. In this case, it was not quite 3% of the internet that disappeared, but it did plummet off pretty quickly after slammer worm started to disappear and came back slowly over the course of the next 17, 18 hours. This chart is smooth because I pasted it from a pitch that I was giving to executives, and they can't handle squiggly lines. So here in summary, I suggested that there are some metrics that can be derived from BGP, that we should be thinking about ways to standardize our vocabulary so that we're all talking about things in some standardized way. Not that necessarily that this is the only way to think about it. I'm looking for feedback. I'm here to suggest that we're looking at this, and if you have any suggestions on this, please write to me, dennis.mcgrath@dartmouth.edu or condor@dartmouth.edu. There are other ways of looking at internet health, and we're also looking at those, and you can look at our netwatch.ists.dartmouth.edu website and see some of the other things that we're looking at, including packet latency and loss measurements, scanning activity, honeypots, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, we need data. Researchers always need data, and we never have enough. I have currently the RIPE and the Oregon repositories to look at. I don't have a lot of real-time BGP feeds. I'm looking at 3 EDU feeds right now. And that's great. I actually get pretty good numbers with those 3 EDU feeds, but I also get a disproportionate contribution from Internet 2. And last week, there was a major instability event on Internet 2, and it sent my global instability indicator haywire. And again, I wrote to my friends at the Department of Homeland Security, and they said, what are you talking about? There's no problems here. And it turns out it was just a link between the Abilene network in Argentina, and South America was just disappearing from Internet 2 on and off for the course of about 8 hours. So if I could have more BGP data, more BGP feeds or peers in real time, I'd appreciate the data. It would really help, and I can't pay you for it, but I can give you a T-shirt. And if you come see me afterwards, I'll give you one. And that's it.
Questions for Dennis? Thank you. I have a question. Hey, up there, Dennis, I have a question. Dennis? You didn't see anything from the blaster worm. Do you have an intuition of why?
The question is, why didn't blaster worm cause instability? It appears that it didn't scan nearly aggressively as its predecessors. Obviously, there was some instability there. It was kind of buried in the noise. Again, you should talk to the guys at Renesys who look at this data much more closely than I do. Welchia actually, which I didn't show, the following week after the blaster worm, Welchia caused a little bit more instability than blaster did, because it had all that ping traffic that was going around as well. But both those worms didn't come near the instability effects that were observed with the previous worms. Seemed to be mostly a problem behind the firewall, and I'm not an expert in what blaster was doing or what it was trying to do, but I certainly think that we haven't seen the last of the very aggressive scanning worms. It's just that those two particular ones were not fast movers the way Slammer was.
Thanks.